Now joining us, Susan Glasser, staff writer at The New Yorker, and former Democratic Congressman Max Rose, currently senior advisor to Vote Vets. Congressman, let me start with you and just your reaction to what we're hearing from President Biden this morning.
That's what everyone's wanted to see for the past 6 days. The president, I'm not even sure if that interview was planned. They were not announcing that interview several hours ago, came on the phone. And so the question is behind the scenes, right? Are there members of the president's staff who have, for the past 2 or 3 years, been saying that's not a good idea? Because that was quintessential Joe Biden, and that was great politics, and they should be doing more of it. But look, Joe Biden's the nominee, and Joe Biden's not going to blink in this game of chicken. So if any further Democrats come out against Joe Biden, they are part of the problem, not the president. It's time that everyone gets together, gets disciplined, and focuses on the actual challenge, the actual problem, the existential threat to the future of this country, which is Donald Trump. They've had a week, all right, to get their act together and mount whatever type of insurgency they're thinking about. That is done. It's over. The president ended it with that interview, and hopefully we see more of it.
So, Susan, Max seems to think this is a game changer, that interview this morning. What was your reaction?
Well, it is a remarkable moment, isn't it, when the incumbent president of the United States is spending the summer of his reelection year focusing on shoring up wavering members of his own party rather than being able to join the fight with Donald Trump, which he has framed himself as an existential threat to American democracy. And I think when you're playing defense in politics like this, the general view is that you're not winning. And I think that's the problem for Democrats right now. And it's the problem for Joe Biden. He's shoring up wavering core members of the Democratic electorate. My question is, what has happened to the independents, the Democratic-leaning independents, maybe even the Republicans who voted for Joe Biden in 2020 because they couldn't stomach the thought of more Donald Trump, who have not come back to Biden for this reelection campaign? They're the ones that Democrats need to be worried about, because right now the polls are very clear that the reason that Biden isn't winning is because he has not locked down the coalition that brought him to office in 2020. And I think the worry for Democrats is that all the effort to bring wavering core members of the Democratic electorate back in line, what is that doing to the people that Biden needs to actually defeat Donald Trump? I don't know the answer to that, but I feel like he's not speaking to those people now when he's trying to speak to his own core Democratic members.
I mean, we saw in that interview, we saw in the letter to Congress, he kept talking about the voter, that the voter wants him to be the nominee and that he is the choice of the average voter, not the elites. Let's listen to more of his interview.
I'm getting so frustrated by the elites. Now, I'm not talking about you guys, but about the elites in the party who they know so much more. But if any of these guys don't think I should run against me, go ahead, announce for president. Challenge me at the convention.
Look, Congressman, the polls aren't exactly backing up this sentiment that the average voter definitely wants Joe Biden. I mean, the polls have been close, right? He's not overwhelmingly beating Donald Trump right now. And the polls keep showing that the majority of Americans do have concerns about his age.
I think polls are showing that there is that concern, but polls are also showing that this race is a dead even race. And
should it be that close?
Really, yeah, this is a divided country. Okay, I mean, and the polls have not shifted in weeks, if not months. But we may look back and look at this debate and these next 6 days and that interview as the market shift, the catalyst that this campaign needed. Now, Joe Biden's the scrappy insurgent waging war on the elites. There's one person that is unhappy with Joe Biden being in that position, and that's Donald Trump. Because that's been the lane that he's always wanted. They're ignoring you, and I'm on your side. But that's where Joe Biden is right now. So look, what he's saying, and he's going direct to the American people, and he's to continue going direct to the consumer here, says, I don't need a filter. I don't need any elite platforms. I don't need any other elected officials because I am fighting for you. My only hope is that now he doesn't go back into a 6-day silence yet again and overplan for a press conference or go back up to Camp David and act like they're prepping for the SATs or a McKinsey interview. Just let the guy be who he is. That was a phenomenal interview.
So, Susan, Biden also said he is just starting to now focus on attacking Trump. But hasn't this all just been a big distraction from talking about Trump? And is that something that should shift strategy?
Well, Anna, to your point, I do think that when, again, you're playing defense, it's very hard to prosecute the campaign against Donald Trump, number one. Number two, the point about the elites is that obviously both parties have decided that it's good politics to be bashing the elites and lining up with the common person. And that is Trump's populist strategy, and it is Biden's populist strategy. But I would point out that with many surveys suggesting as many as 3/4 of Americans believe that Biden is too old to serve as president for another term in office. When you say that only the elites have concerns about President Biden and his age and his performance in the debate, what you're doing is you're insulting a large chunk of your own party at this point that is concerned that you are either too old for office or that problem is such that you are not able to defeat Donald Trump. So the question I have is it really good politics to insult a large chunk of your own electorate that thinks that this is a problem, and to call them bedwetters, as the president's advisors have done, to say that it's not legitimate or it's some media narrative and some fantasy? It's obviously not a fantasy. Let's be clear about that these are legitimate questions that have been raised by people who consider themselves to be loyal Democrats for their entire career, and their concern is beating Donald Trump. No one knows the answer to whether Biden is the best position to defeat Donald Trump or someone else. But it is a risky strategy, it seems to me, to attack this chunk of your own base and to say that they're simply elites who don't know what they're talking about.
I see you shaking your head, Congressman, but I'm looking at like the list of the 9 Democrats who have come out and said it's time for our party to go with a different nominee. We're talking about Adam Smith of Washington and Jerry Nadler of New York and Mark Takano of California. And that's on top of the others that came before them, people like Mike Quigley, Seth Moulton, Raul Grijalva. From across the country, in some key states, if you're a Democrat who is in a purple state or a purple district, how do you handle this right now?
So first of all, it's not 9. That's false reporting. It's 5 that have come out publicly, 4 that did so on a private phone call, and then they have not made the mistake for the last 24 hours to come out and publicly establish where they actually are.
They haven't shut it down, though, to say that's not accurate.
Only 5 have publicly said it. No one can discount that. Only one of which is from a semi-contested district. But what the president is coming out and saying right now is, while he would love everyone's support and deeply cares about their opinion, what matters is 2 things. 1, he won the nomination. And 2, he has an extraordinary record that he is ready to continue to build upon. And with all respect to the 75,000 people that pay for their annual subscription to The New Yorker, they are not representative of the fundamental Democratic base. And that is the base that he is listening to, whether it is African-American communities, whether it is union halls, whether it's people who each and every day are working their hearts out. That's who the president is speaking directly to. And you know what those folks really don't want? Those folks really don't want 90 minutes to define their loyalty to someone who has been there tirelessly for them for a half century. They believe in loyalty and commitment, and they believe in standing up to what is an actual evil and an actual threat to the future of this country. And look, it's unfortunate that Susan's readers disagree with that. I understand. You got to go with the person who's buttering your toast, but that is not where the American people are.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.